Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. I'm Kristen Daly, the Executive Director of Global Washington. I'm happy to welcome you here. We're going to be using microphones mostly for the recording purposes. We'll record this and post it for those people who couldn't make it today. So thank you all for being here. We're excited to really look at this issue of food security and do a deep dive with some of the experts we have in our region, who are actually some of the world experts in food security as well. We're extremely fortunate in this Pacific Northwest to have these experts living here where we can have access and have these conversations. So thank you all for being here. Just briefly for Global Washington, if you don't know, we are a membership network of 165 nonprofit and for-profit organizations that have a presence here in Washington State and do work to improve lives in developing countries. And with 165 members, you can imagine they do everything from climate change to global health to food security. And what we do to organize our work is dive into one issue each month and cluster our members around those issues and look at what their work is doing to improve lives and really get the word out to other members for partnership opportunities and for a targeted audience that care about these issues. So if you received our newsletter this week, we have featured articles in there about a number of Global Washington's members. And we often go to our members and say food security in general and reducing hunger is really important to our members. It's one of the sustainable development goals that Global Washington is really working on. And then we sit down with our members and say, but what is it within food security that's relevant, that's important? And in particular, we spoke with the Hunger Project, who is part of this community-led development approach for food security. So to me, this just sounds like really good development practices. But I'm excited to learn more today about what it means to really have a community-led development approach. I think more and more nonprofits in particular are realizing that no one entity can do this alone, and that we have to reach across silos, across industries, across disciplines to do a more comprehensive approach. And first and foremost, have it really based in community needs and work with people that are living in developing countries to figure out how to have the best solutions. So that's what we're going to learn more about today. The other thing that Global Washington does is as I said, every month we do these issues and then they all roll up into an annual conference. This year our annual conference is on November 15th. I hope you're all signed up to come. It's going to be fantastic. We have usually about 400 people here in Seattle. We have a lot of speakers coming from out of town this year. One of our keynotes is Raj Kumar, who wrote a book about the changing of the aid industry in terms of funding and how nonprofits are reacting to that. So that should be fascinating. So please come. Our two new speakers that we just signed up to are Alex Reed from the Gates Foundation, that leads up a lot of their global policy and advocacy work, and Tony Pippa that works at the Brookings Institute. So hope you can be there. So with that, I wanted to briefly do an introduction of Suzanne, who is actually the CEO of the Hunger Project. And again, Hunger Project is based now in New York City, right? In New York. But Suzanne lives in our region. We're so lucky to have her here. And just a brief intro, Suzanne has an amazing background, both in the private sector and nonprofits. And she's actually been a volunteer and an investor in the Hunger Project for 25 years. And then just in 2017, she was called to be the president and CEO. So she has extensive knowledge of the Hunger Project. She's gone on many trips with them to again, look at this community-led development approach, and then decided to step up in leadership. And somehow, in her spare time, she managed to write a book. So on leadership skills. So what a lucky organization to have a person who is so skilled in leadership and has the passion and expertise. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne. She's going to give a brief overview of the issue and then moderate the conversation and introduce our panelists. And then we'll open it up to Q&A and have a conversation around the table. So thank you.
Thank you. Goodness, what a great introduction. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you everybody for being here today. I think we're expecting a few more people that might come in, so we'll just welcome them in as they wander in. So for today, the topic is under the guideline, as Kristen mentioned, of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 2. So number 2 aims to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture by 2030. And yet, since the SDGs were adopted, we've seen an increase in food insecurity around the world. In 2018, the numbers tell us that nearly 11% of the world population, or about 822 million people, did not have enough to eat. And this is according to the year's State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World report by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, we know as FAO. So that's up from about 811 million over the previous year, marking the 3rd year of increase in a row. In addition, more than 2 billion people, or 26% of the world, are food insecure, meaning they don't have regular access to enough safe and nutritious food. And although most of these people are in low and middle income countries, food insecurity is now also affecting about 8% of people in North America and Europe. So we know that many of those affected are women and girls who still face discrimination and gender inequality. The main drivers of global hunger today include man-made crises of political instability, climate variabilities, and shocks. And these crises compound the effects of one another. They pile onto each other, destroying agricultural lands, productivity and infrastructure, killing livestock, forcing people from their homes, depleting communities' abilities to cope with, and in some cases, restricting the access of humanitarians to deliver food and aid. So despite all this, is everybody down right now? So despite all this, I have hope. When the Hunger Project was founded over 40 years ago, the world's mindset was that hunger was a permanent condition, and that the best we could probably do was to alleviate suffering by temporary solutions like food distribution through humanitarian organizations. And that mindset has shifted significantly. Now the world has come together, we've got the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the world believes we can actually end it. So we know that temporary solutions can't address the root causes of hunger, and that we must work directly with the communities affected by chronic hunger to create sustainable change. So today is going to be discussions on exactly how we're doing that. And I hope by the end of it you'll see that the women and men that partner with the Hunger Project, with World Vision, with Agros, and countless other development organizations who use a community-led approach are not recipients or beneficiaries. They're the leaders and the true heroes. And our opportunity is to be their sidekick or their allies. So the development professionals will share more about how community-led approaches are leading to more food-secure world. And I'd like to invite them to the stage now. Stage! So first we have Ann Hendricks-Jenkins, who's one of my colleagues at the Hunger Project. And Ann serves as a senior advisor for the Movement for Community-Led Development. And the Hunger Project supports that as part of the Movement Secretariat. That's our role. Next to her on her left, Jose Luis Figueroa, senior. Somehow the 5-minute timer went off for me. So let me start over. Next, I'd like to introduce Jose Luis Figueroa, who is the Senior Technical Advisor for Food Security and Livelihoods at World Vision USA. Jose Luis's work focuses on unleashing the economic potential of vulnerable people living in poverty. I love that unleashing word there. And finally, please welcome Alberto Solano, the President and Executive Director of Agros International. Now, Alberto has more than 20 years of experience working in microfinance and sustainable development in Central America. So you have this august panel here now to answer some of our questions. I'll have a couple of questions that each one of them will answer, and then I've got a special question for each of them. And then as Kristen mentioned, we'll open it up for Q&A. So we'll get started with our panelists. And Alberto, would you like to go first? The overall question is, can you tell us how does your organization define community-led development? How do you see that?
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here with this wonderful panel. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Community-led development, it's really about putting the people in the driver's seat. And it's a bottom-up approach, but it's one that puts responsibility of the decision-making, of defining the long-term goals to the people who are the study of development. And it's really about understanding that they are the ones responsible for identifying that long-term goals, the mechanism and the actions to get there, and recognizing that they are the most, they're in the best place to be able to make the best decisions. For us, we're really in the co-pilot seat. Our role is to be facilitators, to be enablers, to build capacities to make that process move. But we have to recognize there's a long-term process. And therefore what Suzanne said at the beginning, it's about partnerships, not beneficiaries. And that's something that we understand very much. We call all the people we work partners. And what we do, just to give you a snapshot of Agros, we are a number of the base in Seattle who works in Central America. And we literally build villages, literally. We go to a country, we buy large tracts of land, we invite the poorest families to come and to the property, and we will, start with them, their community governance, their leadership skills that lead to a community plan where infrastructure, basic services, agricultural development takes place, and over a period of 8-10 years, they become owners of the land, and they become part of a village that is thriving with all the services in place. And right now, we're just launching our 44th village, and that's basically what we do. So we understand that in order to develop those long-term partnerships, it needs to start with understanding the role of families in development. And that's an important aspect, because community governance takes time. It's not something that can be built just one day to the other. Most likely, a lot of the community governance that are in place might not be that representative of the entire village. Might be, in Latin America, heavily politicized as well. So how you build leadership in the community to be able to take over those roles. And we understand at Agros that it's about the family. And it's about recognizing the role of families in the decision-making process. So when we talk about, for example, how we bring women into leadership so they can have an active role in development, is really understanding about what is making very visible, what is the contribution of the household as moms, as spouses, as household leaders, and building those skills so they can then start to work and have those leadership places, roles outside the household, with village banks, with community water boards, and that experience starts to build the skills and the capacities to then take the community roles into a different scale. And we have seen a bunch of strong women taking over leadership roles and really being the persons who interact and set priorities. So community-led development for us is a bottom-up approach, absolutely. But it's also a top-down. And it's a top-down because there's guidelines that we all have to follow. The Sustainable Development Goals are part of those guidances, no? And the country strategies are part of those guidances. The roles and priorities of the local governments, the mayor offices, is part of those guidances. Because, at the end of the day, those are the actors that we have to interact on a daily basis. So understanding what the priorities are of the communities, but understanding how they interact and engage with the local authorities is fundamental to bring three things: broad participation, ownership, and most important, to set that seed of sustainability so that process can continue without the intervention of Agros or Vision or any organization. And at the essence, those three factors, participation, ownership, and sustainability, what makes those kind of movements sustain over time.
Thank you. Alberto, I really appreciate, since Kristen introduced me and talked about the book that we wrote about leadership, I love looking through the leadership lens. So when I heard you talk about community-led development in terms of the building capacities also includes the capacities of the leadership. Because often capacity building is seen as agricultural skills, or those building capacity of leadership. I just love hearing that. Thank you. Anne, would you let us know what community-led development is?
Is this working? Okay, so I'm Ann Hendricks-Jenkins, and today I'm speaking on behalf of the Hunger Project, but also on behalf of the Movement for Community-Led Development and our 65 members who have come together around our commitment to increase recognition of the importance of community-led development as a foundational approach to international and domestic development. So I can give you kind of the overall spiel on community-led development because it's one of my favorite topics. The term originally comes from work with the First Nations in Canada, the Indigenous people of Canada. So it's got a really authentic origin story with regards to coming from communities themselves and calling it community-led development. It does go by many other names, and that's fine too. We use the term community-led development. I have a couple of points that I talk about with regards to community-led development. And one is just a quick overview of what is community-led development in the most general sense. So I have some questions. Which development approach is the best? Which sector is the most important? Which ideas will stick? And the answer is all of them, potentially. But only when the relevant ones are selected and crafted into a mosaic by those whose own lives are at the center of it all. That's where sometimes we miss the boat a little bit in international development. And that is called community-led development. So people are saying, for example, the director of the Office of Maternal and Child Health and Nutrition at USAID is saying we need community development 2.0. Because some of you are old enough to remember, it was kind of popular in the 1970s and in the early 80s, but it got eclipsed by sector-specific work and top-down, expert-driven work. Another high-level person at USAID recently asked at a meeting, who knows how to work on social capital and aspiration? And I was glad to be able to raise my hand, but a lot of organizations have kind of lost the ability to do that. And then from the Global Fund for Community Foundations, they say a new narrative for locally led development is emerging, including from USAID. So you might ask, can you tell me a little more about community-led development? So I have 4 hallmarks that can help you start to get a sense of what it is. And voice and agency of all citizens are central, and that starts with mindsets. It is asset-based, not problem-driven. It is human-centered. It is not technocratic, sectoral, or economic-centered, although it uses all of those great fields in order to inform its work. And it focuses on systemic change, not project-based interventions. What is the most important word in community-led development? It is mindset. If people don't have a mindset of control and voice and agency, all the best ideas in the world are not going to go anywhere. But too often we skip right to our solutions that we already thought of, and we forget to focus on that intangible but critical issue of mindset. Next, here's a question. How do we do community-led development? And I do have a one-word answer for you. We do it through facilitation. It's like you were describing, working with the communities, facilitating so that people's leadership skills can come out, their mindsets can shift. We don't do it by coming in and fixing the agriculture or doing this or doing that. We facilitate communities so that they can focus on their assets, bring out their skills, and figure out how they want to move forward and what they want to focus on. And the last thing is a question, oh, well, that sounds good, but has it ever happened on a really large scale? Because at the Movement for Community-Led Development, we are focused on large-scale community-led development. And the answer is yes. In Indonesia, in 2015, they passed a law called the Village Framework. And now they have a line item in their budget annually for $7 billion. And that $7 billion goes directly to 79,000 villages who have their own local mechanism to figure out what to do with the money, how to prioritize their goals, and how to spend and use those resources transparently. And they have 30,000 facilitators across the country of Indonesia that are government employees that animate the work. So I will stop there and turn it over to Jose Luis.
Great, thank you. Jose Luis, can you tell us, community-led development, how does that show up in World Vision?
So, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the panels. And I agree with what my colleagues just stated. We want to make sure that communities are empowered to make decisions on their own. And so what World Vision has learned over the years is that what we call project models are modular ways of building the strength of the communities. For World Vision, it's called Citizen Voice in Action. And if you Google it, you'll find a complete project model online. It's available. And one of the things that we do for every project that we deploy, and our current footprint is $1 billion a year that we are deploying, and we're reaching 3.3 million people who are empowered to produce their own food and increase their income. And Citizen Voice in Action is a way of making sure that the participants, the community itself, has the capacity to address its own needs and be able to communicate with the local stakeholders. So Citizen Voice in Action for us is a local level advocacy methodology that we implement in every single project that we do. Let me give you one example that we researched with Oxford University in 9 districts in Uganda. And this was work done with communities themselves, and after 4 years of running Citizen Voice in Action, we saw a 33% drop in under 5 mortality rate related to malnourishment. So that tells us that the people who are producing the food have the capacity to go to their clinics and demand better services. One of the things that we've learned over the years, and this is how we implement the model, is that there are already communication methodologies happening in those communities. So if you backtrack to the 1980s, World Vision was a little bubble and we tried to do things on our own. Fast track now to today, we participate in what we call coordination mechanisms, which are present through municipalities. And there are simple mechanisms from a parents' PTA to different communication systems that are in place that are happening around a municipality. And what we do is we strengthen the people that we work with so that they have that advocacy capacity to go and participate, but also demand. This is an accountability mechanism. And so being able to see that along those very lines, this same Oxford University study, we saw a 16% increase in communities' abilities to solve collective action problems, especially around food security, health, and education. So this is a mechanism that we inject into everything we do. It's not only used for food security, we use it as well for health and education. And when I mention, I just want to clarify, $1 billion investment, this is not just World Vision US. As an interfederated model that World Vision is, this represents contributions from Australia, New Zealand, multiple European offices, and Asian offices as well. But all of us, and I think that is the critical value, is all of us use the same project models. And so adding apples to apples, we're able to deploy best practices based on lessons learned that we're implementing cohesively and consistently through the different projects that we are deploying. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I'm hearing lots of words I love: collaboration, comprehensive, sustainability, integrated, all kinds of great words. So far so good. And can we move to you next? And I know very well that you are a key person in the movement for community-led development for the Hunger Project, where the Hunger Project is a secretariat. Could you tell us a little bit more about the movement, the strengths and challenges? What's that all about?
The movement? Yes, so the movement for community-led development ever since I've been working in development for 30 years, and I find myself here working full-time on this community-led development. And one thing that I've really learned is that when you look at the world through a community-led development lens, it's both exciting and positive, and it also can be a little daunting because so much of development is frankly not community-led development. The work plans have already been written by the time anyone sets foot in the country, and it's not that a lot of great work doesn't go on, but it doesn't reach its potential for, as you said, participation, ownership, and sustainability when the community has no ownership, when they have no voice, no agency, no idea about taking action. And as a matter of fact, the worst kind of intervention can actually foster resignation and dependency. So you're actually disempowering communities, sometimes with the very best of intentions. So thus has emerged the movement for community-led development, and that's why we've got 65 members and growing. We've got 10 national chapters because a lot of us see this as the missing piece of where a lot of development is ended up today. And it's also part of the reason that we don't have a lot of sustainability in a lot of projects. As soon as the projects end, the impact goes way down. So with the movement, we look at these different issues from an integrated point of view. And today we're talking about food security. So from a food security point of view, when you look at food security from a community-led development point of view, several things really come out. One is that it should be food and nutrition security. Separating out discussions of food and agricultural output from nutrition seems nonsensical, but actually there's a long history of doing that because a lot of agricultural work has been about increasing yields. And so, but from a family or a community point of view, food without nutrition or nutrition without food, it doesn't make sense. Another thing that we realized from a movement point of view is that food security is truly a gendered issue. Women often have less access to the training, the tools, the techniques. They do a lot of the labor. They often can't get their hands on the revenue that comes from the selling of the crops. And we all know that they're more likely to put it into family-related spending. So I was just meeting with a community in Zambia last week, and we had a meeting with the women, and the women said, we don't have capital, we can't get started, and we can't get the revenue from the sale of the crops. And we said, well, can't you sell the crops? And they said, no. They told us a lot of reasons why, if they tried to sell the crops, their social norms really cause a breakdown. So these are very basic things that are not going to be solved by agricultural techniques, so to speak, but they're going to be solved through facilitation and mindset change. Another thing is that we have the role of the animators or the facilitators. Agricultural extension is so important and it needs to be leveraged. It's often there, but the communities need to demand it, they need to make the most of it. And that can be done through community-led development. Also, food security needs to be an integrated approach. There's capital, there's inputs, farming inputs, there's food banks, there's food storage and processing. There's so many aspects to food security. And women are often time poor, and these things need to be truly integrated. Another thing that is really, I think we all know this, but we're all still working on the many implications, is that farmers are the front line for climate change adaptation. And we need to really figure out what that means from a community-led development point of view, because they need to make decisions all year, every year when things are different. And last, resilience is a community attribute. So from a food security point of view, to be resilient when there's a shock or a stress, there's a drought, there's a shortage, it comes from the community first and foremost. So a resilient nation is made up of resilient communities. So these are all sort of, when you look at food security and nutrition from the point of view of community-led development, these are sort of the top line issues. And I yield my 15 seconds to the floor.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Anne. We'll go to Alberto next. Alberto, Agros does a great job of having locals inform its programming. And can you tell us a little bit more about how Agros responds to the needs of the communities that it serves?
Sure. I think everything starts with a simple tool that I'm sure everybody uses here as practitioners, and it's this participatory community assessment. And that's the first step. Before we go and start working in a community, in a village, in a territory, we take the time to meet with the authorities to understand the landscape. And once that is in place, we go and talk to the villagers, talk to the community. We recognize that the true territorial knowledge is in their hands. They're the ones who really know what are the problems. So we spend the time making that participatory community assessment as a baseline. In every single community, we have a baseline that basically marks the priorities of the community, the problems that they face, and the goals that they want to achieve. And after that, we have developed a comprehensive methodology to basically track progress over time. We call it the Path to Prosperity Index, which is an index that measures 7 dimensions of poverty with different indicators. And we apply that index to every single village and to every single family. So we can track from one year to the other what the change in food security, in poverty, in access to health or access to nutrition, etc., etc., etc. But the important aspect is not that Agros is measuring that. The important aspect is that the communities are organized in a way that they analyze with all the results. And they will then make an assembly and report back to all the villages about what things were achieved, what things fell behind. And the most important thing is that based on the results of the last year assessment, they set up the priorities for our budget. They set up the priorities for the village. And we build 2 levels of intervention. One, the family level plan, that we will tackle X family, Y and Z difficulties, and the community overarching goal. And we've been tracking that for just 3 years now. But we can see the progress over time based on a real assessment of results that where we facilitated the measurement, but they facilitated the analysis and the decision making after that. And it's a growing process. No? It has its growing pains. There's always difficulties on getting alignment, but we have seen over the time how much that can influence results. And let me give you an example. No? In Nicaragua, we just went through some terrible 2 years, 18 months, where the government went after the citizens with a lot of repression and violence. Political rights were basically dismantled. And it affected the whole country, every single Nicaraguan. And our villages as well. Even that our villages are so far away from Managua, they were impacted. We had like a month where there was no produce that could be sold to the market, where nobody was investing, where people had fear to even go out. And that impacted the whole living of the community. So the community governance body called for an assembly. We start talking about what they could do to address this solution and these problems. And they come with a couple of interesting things. One is to start moving away from the cash crops, the value chain approach that we have. We didn't abandon it, but they start to say, let's put more emphasis on building food staples. Let's put more emphasis on crops that can be commercialized in the territory, that doesn't need to be commercially or have a cold chain. So they start to basically take the decision based on the areas and the channels they were seeing, and it was successful. However, even our families were able to go through the crisis, and all of them had several harvests last year, that small crisis took us back 3 years. To the statistic, we had 3 years in terms of food security and poverty. Small external factor can have a significant change and impact over the resilience of families. And our families are very resilient, and I just can't imagine the impact that the families outside agriculture had. But again, to the point, when you have a community that is empowered, that true leadership exists, that they can go and talk to the authorities, they can take corrective measures to address the challenge they have in a very successful way. And for me, that was a real example of community resilience, of local leadership, and of participatory local governance in action.
Thank you. Thank you. Jose Luis, your turn. As a representative of the world's largest NGO, no pressure here. Can you talk to us a bit about what it takes to scale a community-led approach? Often scale and customization and really listening to what's needed don't seem like they fit together. So can you say something about that, please?
So let me frame it into the good and the bad. The good is that my colleagues already mentioned, you know, the different approaches that we can take, and again, I'm going to mention citizen voice in action is actually inserted into every project that we deploy. And so we make sure that community representatives are present for all the projects that we deploy. That's positive. We found that sustainability-wise, that leads into having empowered people being able to take over the decisions that affect their lives. And so this is a proven practice that we've seen being deployed consistently. The bad of things, timing is an issue. And I think it was Anne that mentioned, you know, it's not always easy to talk about the level of funding in a community. So I'll use an example right now. I'm working on a particularly large Food for Peace project for Ethiopia. And the application process is exceedingly complex, and a couple of months to write a proposal for Food for Peace is not enough time. So the other thing is that it's a competition, and although we partner heavily with colleagues from CARE, CRS, and other organizations, it's still a competition. So there's no guarantee that the funds will reach that community. So empowering them and letting them know there is the possibility of $175 million that will be reaching X amount of communities in Ethiopia. It's a wish list, it's an aspiration at this point. And we don't know how much of that will reach each of those communities if we are selected in an award. So although we have modular approaches that allow us to empower people, the information doesn't always flow the way you would want to, you know, and it's one of the things that we've learned in World Vision is that generating expectations can be very damaging. So when you talk about funding coming over here and then you don't get the funding, you not only lose credibility, that's not the biggest issue, it is an issue, but people get discouraged. I've actually been in meetings where community leaders actually, you know, took the road and said, you can't get out until you solve this question, where's the money? And you know, that was generated out of somebody blurting out, hey, we're gonna have $1 million for this community, aspirationally. But again, it's an application process. You know, sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. All it takes is a competitor to get it, or in the case of a private donor, the donor to decide, no, I'm not putting my money there, I'm going to put it in another sector or in another country, and then that generates damage. So you have to be careful in the way that, yes, you want to empower, but information often flows not the way you want, and timing is a critical issue. So what I would say is that definitely you gotta put all your effort on deploying your best practices. And for us, we have identified those practices, and we know that partnership with our community leadership is something that we know how to do. But you can't always share every single thing you know, or at least you have to be very careful, because you can damage relations by generating expectations that later on do not materialize. And I could talk a lot about local stakeholders going back on promises as well. You know, so one of the key issues that we do is work with governments, and we've been set back because of signed agreements with local ministries that took maybe 2 years longer than we expected to materialize, because of political decisions or budget constraints or a lot of difficult circumstances that were not under your control. But then again, you want to empower people with information, but that doesn't always work in your favor. I'll stop right there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, I have a closing question for each of you, for all of you to answer, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. you know, the recent reports, as I mentioned in the very first part of the presentation today, that the recent reports indicate that food insecurity is actually increasing. So what we've been talking about here today is the impact or the possibility that community-led approach has. So given that we've been talking about that, the food insecurity has been driven primarily by external factors. So how do you correlate, you know, what's your hope for the 2030 goals? How do you correlate this food insecurity, external factors, community-led development? What role does that play? What can we do to reach each goal? So let's see, why don't we start, Alberto, would you go first this time?
Sure. Let me start by telling you that I don't have a 5-minute answer to that. You know, that's a tough one. I consider myself a natural optimist. I always say the glass half full. I was thrilled by the opportunities that tomorrow brings. This one is a tough one. And it's a tough one because it's not a matter of technical skills. You know, I think our organizations and the sector and the governments actually know how to do it. And they have proven methodologies and approaches to actually tackle hunger. But it's a matter of political willingness. And when you see what's going on in Latin America and our countries, we have had over the last 2 years some of the worst political instability, almost compared to, not as bad, but close to what happened in the 80s. Just in the last 2 weeks, we had huge riots in Ecuador. Today in Bolivia, last week in Chile, the strongest democracy, the most developed country in Latin America, with massive protests for something that is hard to explain. No? So the political instability of our countries are one of those external factors that impact our work significantly and our capacity to operate, and will have long-term repercussions with families. So that is one factor that really concerns me, just seeing how immature we are still with our governments and how corruption actually has a role to play in the work of everybody. The second thing is, just the fragility. I don't know if that's an English word. It's how fragile our farming systems still are, despite all the work and investments and technical assistance and all that infrastructure in place. They're pretty weak. And just take a look at what happened with the coffee crisis. We went because of climate change, we had big impact on the coffee yields and the coffee rust, and farmers were heavily affected. Then 4 years of the worst prices ever. Right now we have the worst price in the last 14 years. So how that can impact not just like a family, a whole region, and how that 1, 2, 3 years of external thing can set back a family itself. So I think there's a lot of analysis that we need to do about going back and working on resilience to make sure that those external factors don't really impact the families. No? And I'm not going to get to climate change, but those are the things that I'm really concerned about. Again, I don't think it's a matter of technical skills. I don't think it's about operation. I think that's part of the answer. I'm more concerned about how we can influence the political spectrum to really have that sustained approach.
Alberto, do you have a bright light in there anywhere? If there's a place for optimism for you, where is it?
Absolutely. I don't want to sound.
I'm not trying to force that on you.
I think the optimism comes, getting to know the families and seeing their achievements. And when we started working here, the average farmer had 1.8 harvests a year. 2 years ago, we were at 3.6. Today, we're pushing 5 to 6 harvests a year. Once you push the 3 harvest level, that's breaking forward. That's sustaining change. That builds the capacity of the families to really not think of it as food security, but actually build that prosperity in their lives. So, yeah, I think those stories of families who are able to make it through, and the stories of the staff taking risk and doing all what it takes there, it will inspire us. So yeah, the political things is something that we have to deal with, but it will never jeopardize the efforts of the people in the field, but at the end, who make it happen.
thank you for presencing them. Great. Jose Luis, how about you?
Okay, let me start with the positive, and I like sharing this story because the gentleman I'm mentioning is a friend of mine from Australia. His name is Tony Renato, and he recently, in 2018, got the Right Livelihood Award. And this is a very prestigious award. He got this award as stated in the website of the Right Livelihood Foundation for demonstrating a large-scale how drylands can be greened. And this is a simple approach, methodologies again, best practices, in which we call it farmer managed natural regeneration. At no cost, you prune the trees that you have, and they regrow.
Say that again, that three.
FMNR, farmer managed natural regeneration. Tony Renato, in his lifetime, has been able to regenerate, through his teaching, 17.3 million acres, impacting 6 million people by improving crops and reducing hunger. So we have methodologies that we can implement, and we've proven that they work. People can have better food. They can produce enough to feed their families. But, and here is the but. Often nonprofits work in the micro level. At the macro level, what is affecting hunger? Climate change. So we can implement the best practices, but next year is particularly predicted to be one of the worst for agriculture globally. So we're going to see a lot of droughts and a lot of the same droughts when we need water, and extreme flooding when we don't need that water. That's going to continue happening. Economic slowdown is also affecting people's capacity to feed their families. And finally, conflict and government setbacks, the politics. So that's something that we need to address. That's something where our capacity to lobby needs to come into place. One of the things this was on the news this morning, the Green Fund was asking, for an additional injection of funding, and was hoping to meet its targets, even though the U.S. and Australia are absent at the table for this particular funding period. So, in the middle of one of our worst crises as humans, we're seeing that several governments that are critical to solve the problem are not jumping and owning the requirement of actually being able to fund some of the issues that we know we can address. The Green Fund uses a lot of the methodologies and promotes a lot of nonprofits with some of the things that we mentioned. But it seems that we live in challenging times where it's a balance between knowing what to do and having the resources to do it, and the mindsets. I want to go back to mindsets. I think that's critical at the community level, but it is critical at the global leadership level as well. And right now, that is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. It's not that we don't know how to solve the problem. The resources are getting very challenging, and the politics are not working in our favor. I'll stop there.
Yeah, they're clearly the external threats that, the politics, the world, the will, the mindset, sort of this top level is very influential and is listed in those external threats. I'm curious, Jose Luis, can you say a little bit about how your citizen voice in action and your local level advocacy methodology, it seems to me that those pieces really help people at the community level to be able to deal with climate change adaptation and some of the kind of political changes they see in their country. At some point, those external threats have to be able to build resilience from within. And it seemed to me that maybe those two pieces played a good part.
Yes. So one of the critical aspects of empowering people is that they are able to go to their municipal governments and demand, and that can be led up higher into the national level government. And so we've seen that. We've seen really empowered leaders demanding more resources, better care of natural resources in their community, better services for their families. So that's really positive. That's one of the things that, again, what I was stating is that we have methodologies in our hands because of decades of working in development, that we've proven that they work. And I think it's really positive when you get to see leadership develop, but it can also be frustrating because I've seen a lot of frustrated leaders in communities where they demand for the services and they feel that they're empowered and entitled to go and say, well, you know, there's taxes being paid, this is something that is for the general benefit of the community, we need to see some action around these items. But then they face the challenge of, well, you know, this municipality has very limited budget. So this is as much as we can do. Let me use a typical example, and it's not necessarily around food security, is education. One of the lowest investments for most developing countries, where it's only salaries for teachers. There's no mention of the quality of education. That's one typical example where you get to see, well, it's not that people are not empowered and don't demand it, because this is something we're beginning to see as a movement, that we're beginning to see more empowered leadership at community levels. But often they meet roadblocks that do not lead into the positive results that they were hoping or aspiring for, and they become frustrated as well.
Right, okay, clear. You know, so there's a benefit of this rural development and community-led development to people having voices and agency and coordinating with their local governments, and then they get to run into the frustration of what's there and those bureaucracies. That's the next piece to conquer. Great, thank you. Anne, how would you answer this question?
Okay, so talking about food insecurity, rising threats of food insecurity, it's incumbent on all of us to be better than ever, because some of these threats are greater than ever. My son is really worried about climate change, and for good reasons. So I can give two examples just to sort of ground this conversation about how our work with food security needs to enable really responsive, being very responsive to the context, and then also that we need integrated and sustainable solutions that don't depend on us as international actors always being there. So the first example is from Benin about being responsive to the context. And that is another big group, in addition to women, that really warrants a lot of attention, is youth, the huge youth populations of this world. And we work with rural youth, but they're all moving to the urban areas. So they come home for the holidays and then they go back to the urban areas. So the work we've done with them around agriculture is now taking a new form, which is a focus on urban and peri-urban agriculture as an entrepreneurial opportunity for youth that also has nutritional implications, so that the people of the urban areas, because urbanization is another huge one, can get the nutritious food available that they need. And also, again, there's a big role for the government here with regards to training, farming inputs, available land, a value chain. You know, my colleagues in Benin were telling me that they're importing tomatoes from Burkina Faso, which is less green than Benin because of the lack of the value chain elements in Benin, and that's really a government job to make work. So, and the government needs a dynamic civil society in order to know about these things and be able to be responsive. So, in a lot of places, there's not yet the dynamic civil society that needs that push and pull relationship with the government, which can be the source of frustration and also in the long term can be the source of progress and government responsiveness within a context. So that's one example about the very specific context. And so now we find ourselves addressing urban and peri-urban agriculture when we historically work with rural communities, but it's in response to the needs of youth. Also, apparently there's a lot of university-educated youth without jobs, and this can be the temporary solution while they're looking for jobs that enables them to stay in the city and look for the jobs. So, I mean, I never could have come up with that. And then the other example I have is from Malawi. 2 weeks ago, I met with a woman named Ziana Gonakanye, and she told me the story of how in 2004, she ended up on a 30-kilometer journey by foot trying to buy maize with a baby on her back and coming home to find out that she'd been sold chaff, and she tried to cook it for her children and they couldn't eat it. And she said that she just looked down and cried and she felt so bad about herself. She has 8 children, now she's 50 years old. But then, in 2004, she got 3 days of agricultural training and a small loan, and she said she has never gone hungry since then. That year, she produced 20 bags of maize. She was able to pay back her small loan with 3 bags of maize, which went into the community food bank, which is then maize that's sold back to the community when people's home stores run out. And ever since then, she never needed to take out another loan until last year because of climate issues. And so she was able to take out another loan, and she was able to produce 10 bags of maize last year. But no matter what, she says she doesn't ever fear being hungry again because they've got this self-reliant epicenter, it's called, in their community. And she told me, these are her words, translated, "As I speak now, we are a liberated people. We have freedom. Without food, you are missing the most basic need. You can't even listen at church if you are hungry. Yes, I can tell you my life has changed." So that's the positive side. And even with the negative issue of food insecurity, that community is facing it together, and they are able, as an independent organization, because the Hunger Project is not even there anymore, to keep the small loans and tide everyone over through the hard seasons. So again, that's a very integrated response. And just let me add to that, which is that when she has her maize, now she can get it ground at the maize mill at the local epicenter, which is part of that epicenter. And that is the same epicenter where her children give birth now, because she said in the past they gave birth along the side of the road. So it's an integrated approach. She also buys flour there to make donuts to sell them, to get the cash when she needs to buy maize when she runs out of her own maize every year. So that is a super integrated, sustainable response, and we need as much of that as possible to address the threats that are coming on from climate change.
Thank you, Anne. Sure. And thank you to all 3 of you. We now have opened up for Q&A, so get ready for some stimulating questions. Who has the first one? Yes, please, Patrick.
Alberta, you had mentioned that once you started working with these farmer villages, they were able to change their cropping diversification from 2 harvests a year to 5. That's a pretty significant change. What that tells me is that perhaps, and I think you mentioned, they put less effort and less land towards the merchantable commodity crops like maize or maybe coffee, and put it into other produce that they sold or bartered within the region. So how did that alternate market get created? Because at the end of the day, they do need kind of the cash coming in, income, to enable them to diversify like that.
There's several ways to respond to that. First of all, that level of change in your production systems can only be possible through innovation, through technology, through understanding what it takes to be successful as a farmer. And as a farmer, there's 2 main things that you have to manage to be successful. You have to produce more than 1 crop. You have to be able to produce a variety of crops across the year, so you can respond to demands and seasonal changes. You have to be able to be reliable in your production, and you have to be good quality. So it's not just subsistence agriculture, it's really embracing what it is, understanding what it is to be a farmer or a producer, not a farmer, a producer, that it's totally part of the value chain. And to be able to do that integration is not just about technology and technical assistance, it's understanding what role organizations like us have to play. And we have basically defined 3 types of interventions. You go to a country like Honduras, where you have founder or actors who have very strong community-led value chain approaches, where they already facilitate the intervention of the farmers to the market. Our role is to go there and continue to work with Funder to enable them to do more. If you go to a country like Nicaragua, where you have few actors with all the power and that imbalance, our role is actually to go and start building that value chain intervention, which is sometimes building transportation, sometimes collection centers, providing extension services. So it's understanding what is the country dynamics and what role you have to play in order to help farmers move along the value chain. But at the end of the day, it's all about, helping them understand that farming is a business, that you compete in San Pedro Sula as hard as you compete in Yakima, and in order to be able to move beyond just simple production, you have to get certified. You have to adopt best agricultural practices, now climate resilient practices. So it's a work in progress that I will say today being a farmer is much more difficult and much more demanding than it was to be a farmer just 5 years ago. The level of requirements that the global markets are imposing and the competition is really tough. But our families have proven to be able to do it.
Thank you. Who's got the next question?
I've got one.
Please.
So thank you, for sharing. I think that, what brought me here today is I think the three things we're really wrestling with in our programs are with food security is urbanization, climate change, and conflict. You've touched on some of this, but I was wondering if any of you could speak a little bit more to best practices and lessons learned as you're partnering with communities in terms of specifically the impacts of conflict. I mean, I think we're seeing in a lot of our projects in Yemen, South Sudan, DRC, and other places, conflict just completely eroding food insecurity, a lot of famine or brink of famine related to conflict, but also some of our community-led development work being severely undermined or even kind of destroyed in light of conflict. So I'd love to just hear from your experiences if you have things that you're learning about journeying and partnering with communities as they experience conflict, both in relation to, yes, diversifying risk so that you can be more resilient in the face of these shocks like protests in Nicaragua, but also kind of the long-term need for, building peace within these communities. So I'd just love to hear from your experiences with that.
Maybe I'll do an initial one and you guys can jump in. So one of the things that we've learned, and I'm talking about extreme conflict, where you resettle the population and you have refugee camps. It makes it much more difficult to talk about community leadership when you resettled an entire population, not all of them from the same village. The structures that we're used to working in a normal environment in a community that's struggling for development are not the same ones that you have present under conflict. A lot of those structures are gone, and we have to recognize that. You no longer have that school, so that PTA is no longer meeting. And you have settlements that unfortunately are not temporary. And this is one of the biggest learnings that we have, is that those settlements have been there for decades. And they're now new communities. Those settlements are also challenged in the sense of having their own sense of identity and nationality and citizenship recognized. So establishing those structures which were present in their previous community becomes more of a challenge. Now you're talking about legislation. And again, the politics come into play in a country wherever the refugee camps are settled. But economic development continues. And that's one of the key learnings that we have as well, is that people can benefit from savings groups, from organizing themselves, from finding crafts and ways of getting a livelihood in a settlement that's been there for a long time. And that to me was personally, when I visited a couple of camps in Rwanda, is that people are doing business. And they either do business in the camp or leave the camp and come back to the camp. So there are new structures in place. And so incomes and the capacity of families to feed themselves and cover for their needs continue. And you can work around that. Now, it is definitely a drawback that community leadership is a bigger challenge. And again, it comes to the point of saying, you can organize the community in a settlement, in a refugee camp, but are they even recognized by the local government? And so there's diminished level of recognition in most places. It's a good situation when there's good legislation going on and people can be assimilated, but that's usually not the case. And so that ongoing challenge is the reason that you see those refugee camps lasting decades, and they become new settlements, still branded under refugee camps, still receiving external assistance, and definitely under new structures that find much more higher challenges in being recognized and being able to operate within the established systems. So very different than what I was talking about, people pushing upward through their municipality. You no longer have that municipality in place. And so you're dealing with whatever assistance is being provided to those refugee camps. But again, one of the things that I found encouraging is seeing the level of economic development activities that still take place, and you can strengthen those to make sure that people are making a better living for their families and their children.
Thank you.
I can speak a little bit kind of in a larger sense to the case study of Indonesia, which is historically in the last several decades suffered a lot of local domestic terrorism and violence. And one of the big impetus for community-led development there was the prevention of violence, internal violence and terrorism. The idea is that community-led development helps foster peace and stability at the community level because people have a way to buy into their country and their own voice and agency. So the idea is that they decentralized the community-led development. They skipped the provincial elites because they could actually become powerful cohorts working together politically to undermine the federal level, and they sent the money all the way down to the domestic level, to the village level, with a mechanism for local village prioritization and spending of those funds, which meant that local elections in Indonesia are thriving now, and a lot of these groups who in the past said they were being left out and alienated have now all run for office, and they hold local positions, you know, for better or for worse, depending on some of the policy stances that they take. But they're part of the system now, and they're really, and the levels of terrorism and domestic internal violence in Indonesia are at an all-time low. A lot of it due in spirit to this community-led development mechanism. So that's kind of a longer-term prevention. And also it's making the political case for community-led development. That's why it went through, one of the big reasons it went through in Indonesia, because it's kind of unheard of that such a huge amount of power of resources got so massively decentralized in the course of one big set of legislation. It took a lot of years building up to that. So that's one of the reasons we say community-led development is great, because it promotes local peace and stability when done well.
Thank you, Anne. Ro, anything to add there to that question?
I think it's just, working in those environments is very challenging. And President Uribe of Colombia said that security and rule of law and the rest of the state is a primary factor to any economic development effort. And I have experience to work with Venezuela and Colombia, an area full of drug trafficking and paramilitaries and guerrilla. And any development effort that occurs in those places is extremely challenging. It's extremely challenging to organize people. It's extremely challenging to have a staff that is willing to work there. So, definitely people have that entrepreneurship spirit, and they will look for ways to be successful in those environments. But to have a sustainable effort that can really take families to a different level, I stay with President Uribe. You need security, President of the state and rule of law. And that's something that it's at the long term will have an amazing differentiating factor to anybody's efforts.
We have at least a couple of students here, and I'm wondering what question you might have of this august panel that would help further your studies or your understanding. You're used to being called on. Maggie or Nicole, either of you, have something? Maggie, something for you?
to know, I don't know if it's really a question, I guess, but I'm just more interested in the gendered approach with the community-led development and what that looks like, I guess, in changing the mindsets.
In the gender approach, what does it mean changing mindsets in that?
Good question.
Who would like to take that one?
Sure, I think we can all speak to that because we all know that if you don't actively address gender all the time, it will default to not gender involvement across genders, let's just say that. But I was in a rural community in Mexico, and there was a community meeting where they were showing off all the progress that they had made. And this one woman stood up in front of 300 people and said, before this intervention came here, we women, we weren't invited to meetings, and if we did come to the meetings, we were told to sit in the back, and if we did try and talk, we were told to shut up. And she looked around at everyone, she said, no one tells us to shut up anymore. And so that is in the course of just a few years in addressing gender norms that go back a long, long time. And everybody was good with it because the rising prosperity of the entire communities, everybody was very excited about the progress. And that took a lot of facilitation and animation from our local staff there who were very skilled and progressive in their thinking and understanding and sympathetic to the context within which they were working and carefully making the case and moving the concept of voice and action forward. It takes a lot of skill, a lot of nuance, and but amazing progress can be made in a relatively short time. But if it's just a checkbox or a last-minute thing, it gets put by the wayside. Even the most gender-focused people will find themselves in situations sometimes like, how did we end up with all men at this meeting? What happened? You know, we looked away for a minute and this is what happened. So it takes a lot of diligence. And youth is the same way, especially in Africa as well. It takes a change in mindset to the idea that youth should be at the table and they have something to offer because historically, traditionally, that wasn't the way things were done there. So.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to add, because I agree with everything you said, but so I'll give you two examples. One in Honduras where I was able to see, and obviously gender is one of the approaches that we strongly promote. I've seen a lot of empowered women who take leadership in their communities. This particular example that I'm citing in Honduras is of a woman who, from very poor origins, she actually rose to be the leader in her community. All the way, this is in an urban area in Tegucigalpa, the capital city, where maras or gangs are very have a strong presence, and was able to change the structures in that community. And I think that's the critical aspect, that when we're talking about gender, and my gender colleagues always remind me that it's not just the mindsets. The mindsets are important, but it's about the structures, the norms, the policies in place as well. So that's a great example of actually seeing huge empowerment on behalf of women and actually taking the reins of the development of the community. But then, I think it was last year, in Tanzania, visiting Maasai communities, where I got explained how is the community leadership structured. And they tell me, if you're old, married, and have a lot of children and land, you're at the front of the council. So you sit in the front when the council meets, the community council. So it's a recognized structure for the Maasai. If you are younger but married and have some children, you're somewhere in the middle. If you're a single man, then you're probably in the back of the room. And I asked, so what about the woman? Well, you know, they tend to be in the back if they are invited at all. And so, again, you go into the norms, mindset, structures in place. And I think most countries have really good policies around this, but I think the policy is, I don't want to say that it's the easy one, but you can address the policy and write into your constitution and write into your laws that these are the way things should be. gender child protection issues, tend to be well respected because the United Nations has disseminated good policies in multiple countries. The norms, the structures, and the mindsets are much more difficult. And so this is the same example. We were promoting livelihoods projects, and the Maasai don't eat chicken. That's below them. They only manage cattle. So when we started with this community, they said, well, maybe the woman could do chicken. That's good for them. It so happens that the poultry businesses started giving more money than the cattle businesses. And now the men are wanting to jump into the poultry business because they saw money into it. And it may not be the best approach, but it is one way of addressing those mindsets and norms, is when you start showing the work and trying to give women a voice at that council. Now, any organization will find it hard to come in and say, you have to put the woman in front. I mean, we all want to say that, but you have to recognize you're dealing with structures and norms that have been in place for generations. And so it's not so simple. And although you push towards that, what you have to find is ways to prove that not only should they be at the front of the council, they deserve it and they can prove their worth to be there as contributors to society and their community as well. It's a very difficult subject, especially when you're dealing, very stark mindsets like Maasai. And you go like, okay, so that's the way it is, that's the way it's been with my parents and my grandparents, and that's the way it will continue being. So how do you change that? And there are ways of doing it, not by force, but by good development work and empowering women to be contributors again to that community.
Thank you. Yes, Alfred?
Yeah, just to complement the answers of my colleagues here. We have a approach to gender is a little different. We look at gender through the family lens, not through a women lens exclusively, but through a family lens. What that means, it's about, for us, elevating the role of women and the contributions of women within their context, in their family. And it starts by the relationship that they have with their husbands. And so, we make it with very simple things. If you want to be part of an Agros village, well, there's no way a man will be accepted without the buy-in of the women. We actually have 2 applications, one for the men, one for the women. And they both have to fill it out, and then we can double check and compare things. They will never be selected if they both, as a family unit, don't go to the meetings and attend, are totally buy-in. And once you're elected and you're selected to be part of the village, the process is set up in a way that there is a clear recognition from the man that he will never make it without the women. How is that? Well, we start doing what we call a family plan. And the family plans just help, as a household, look themselves into the future, what they want to achieve, what are the goals they're going to get them. And they start doing it separately. Men do it themselves, women do it themselves. And then they come together and they actually combine. Sometimes they match some, but always you're going to see the bias of women towards family and education and caring, and they're looking more holistically. Man is looking to the economic part. However, in all women's family plans, the economic aspects come very strongly. So forcing that joint vision of family, where the role of the women is so clearly notorious in the final product, it starts to change the mindset of the male about how important it's the role of the spouse as their partner, as their economic partner, and the decision-making partner to make it there. And finally, Agros is about land, as I mentioned before. The goal is that these families who are landless farmers will end up owning a home, owning their land, owning their future. So the title goes on the name of both parties. So once the land is paid back, the title goes in the name of the men and the women. And believe me, that is not common. 95% of the land titles are under names. And it happens. Not here. And I think it's, again, gender, for us, it's important within the context of the family. And we believe that when males recognize how much they need the women to actually be successful, that changes the mindset, and then you see those empowered women who change the relation at home, taking a lot more ownership and responsibility outside the home and the communities and leading that second phase of leadership and women empowerment.
Nice. Great, thank you. One last one.
Question for you, Alberto. When you mentioned that you're inviting landless farmers to join a village, is the mechanism of joining becoming a member of a farmers cooperative or association? Because at some point you need an entity to then have dialogue with local stakeholders like government officials and people who have been there and have enabled the situation to be where it's been so long. So they're sort of intransigent to change. So what is the mechanism by which you then negotiate with the stakeholders to become established?
That's our outcome, Patrick. We would love to see these families organizing themselves, to have cooperative farm associations, to have those strong organization structures. But they don't start like that. These are landless farmers who come from street poverty, who are internal migrants, which means that they move 6 months of the year to the north for coffee harvest, and they move 3 months to their place. So are families who maybe even dysfunctional. They haven't lived together for a long time. So it's hard for them when they come to the village to even imagine themselves organizing in that area. It takes a lot of years to get to that place. And when you actually see these family plans I was mentioning about, the first couple of years, they're very small. Their goals and their dreams are really small. You know, but as they achieve them, they start to dream bigger, dream bigger. But yes, what you're saying, right now we just graduated villages in Honduras last June. They have their own farm associations that are totally plugged into market, where you have a women association itself doing different kind of business and demand, but where women are as well part of the farm association of demand. So it's a village. So we aim to achieve that point. It just takes a long process to get there.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank the panel and also give you one chance to have 1 or 2 sentences of encouragement and uplifting optimism as we leave this meeting and face traffic or whatever else we're facing. So I give, hopefully I talked long enough for you to think of something awesome to end with. So, Luis, what's a sentence or two you'd like to end with?
Yeah, one of the actors we often forget is the private sector. We're beginning to work, Alberto was talking a lot about that, the market. So one of the things we're beginning to do a lot of is work with the private sector as one of the stakeholders that has an interest. And of course for the private sector, there has to be a win-win relation. But we can find win-win relations when we have some of the best products that I've ever seen. Produce biggest heads of lettuce, whatever you want to call it, biggest peppers that are out there. And that's actually beneficial. If we can deliver the quantity and quality that the market asks for, we're able to connect with them and do that win-win. And we're beginning to see a lot more of that as the private sector comes in the view of nonprofits as a critical stakeholder we haven't worked enough in the past with, and we're beginning to do that. And I think that's encouraging because, again, I don't think that the solution lies exclusively in governments or nonprofits. It's a society issue, and society includes all the stakeholders in that society. So I find that particularly encouraged. As I talk with more representatives of companies, I get more excited because they're really on board with finding solutions that are beneficial to all members of society.
Great, thanks for bringing that constituency in. How about Roberto, how about you? What are your last great words for this group?
I will say collaboration and partnership. And just seeing across the table, work concern, war issue, hunger trade, there's so much learning, there's so much experience here that I think collaboration, partnership, and a desire to be humble learners. It's something that we can benefit so much. So thank you for doing what you guys do.
Thank you. Anne?
I totally agree, and I think that as a global community, we have so much helpful things that we can bring, so much knowledge and experience in different places that we can bring to communities. And so I love all of our work around that. And I would just want to end with this quote from Mauricio Lynn Miller from his book called The Alternative, Most of What You Believe About Poverty is Wrong. And his quote is, "To get positive change, outsiders must first recognize the thousands of right things that people are doing for themselves. These are the changes most likely to grow and sustain in the long term. The policymakers, nonprofits, and funders must learn how to learn from the people themselves. Find out first what people are already doing for themselves and keep those efforts central."
Great, thank you.
Sure, wow. Why don't you first join me in thanking the panelists for this and I just want to say this is what Global Washington's all about. I mean, both individually you all doing your own work, but then the collective efforts and the whole idea of partnership and collaboration, the community-led development and the movement. So it makes me very proud to have you all here with us today. And I would just encourage everyone to learn more about this. So your takeaway is to go tell one person at least about something you learned today. Learn more about these organizations. We have an issue brief here as you leave that lists other nonprofits and for-profits that are doing this work, and more that you can learn. As I mentioned, this issue in particular is going to be talked about at our conference on November 15th, and actually it's more around how conflict is playing into food security. We have one person on the panel who's from Yemen that's doing Yemen relief and development work there. So very interesting take on this. And also just learn more, I would say one thing, Rick Steves, the travel journalist, has just came out with a documentary on food security. Agros is one of the organizations that he worked with in Guatemala, I believe, right, was the profile? And the other profile is in Ethiopia. So look for that documentary as well. And just get involved to the extent that you can. Learn more, tell others, volunteer if you can, figure out where your passion is and continue down that road. So with that, I think I'll leave that, and hopefully our speakers will have a few minutes to stay and meet you all. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.